blow this up.
Look alive, Bomb Squad. We are back for another installment of Let's Blow This Up. The Season 3 co-host collective series rolls on, and today it's the Boys Club. Jay Franze, Marc Ronick joining me. What's going on, fellas?
Hey, Jason.
Did either of you bring the No Girls Allowed sign for our little fort here?
They're permanently plastered all over my studio. What are you talking about?
Right?
Kidding,
Well,
of course.
Of course. No, it's good to have you guys here. It's been a hell of a run with these episodes this year. I'm having a blast connecting with everybody, and today we're going to continue that tradition as we talk about something that's a little bit of a break from the norm here on Let's Blow This Up. A lot of our talk typically focuses on how to utilize a podcast in your business and to grow and scale and ultimately use it as a content machine, as something that can build visibility. Clearly, there are many benefits that we've talked about on past episodes, but today we're going to go a different route, and we're going to talk about the entertainment side of podcasting. And what do you do if you want to start a show that isn't necessarily built for making money, but more so exploring a passion, more so for talking to people that you want to have genuine connections with? All three of us have done that in one way, shape, or form in our podcast careers. Jay, you probably more than me and Mark at this point are still doing something in that capacity with the Jay Franze show. So today we want our listeners, if you're thinking about podcasting from maybe a hobbyist perspective, but even if it is something that you do eventually want to monetize, our goal here is to help you get invested in the passion that's needed to continue building upon that podcast content so you keep getting better at your craft and your content becomes something that you can monetize. So 3 voices to lend support and help in that regard are here for you today. We'll start with Mark, because Mark, I think you beat both Jay and I to the punch when it came to starting a podcast that was all built around passion.
Yeah.
And it's in the fantasy football realm, so this was something I could have definitely used back in the day had I known you existed. Tell us all about your show and how that all came to life.
Yeah, just a passionate fantasy football enthusiast, and I think I started that when I was in college. And after college, I had a bigger passion for it. It just kept growing, and I got all my local buddies to get involved in a fantasy football league, and I still found myself just craving those discussions around fantasy football, and particularly the NFL. And it was one of those things where I was also looking to have an edge against all my friends. And so I would go and look for resources, and I would find websites, and I stumbled on a couple. I think one of the first ones I stumbled on, it's still out today. It's it's Football Guys. That's the name of it. And I found their website first. I saw something called podcast on their website, and I said, all right, let me see what this is. And I took a listen, and I was hooked. I loved it. And I've always been a fan of talk radio as it is. And so when I saw that people could do this on the internet even 20 years ago, I was like, I got to do that. This is something I want to do. I want to talk about it. I've had success in this area, so why not just find a couple other people who want to talk about it too and share our knowledge, our experience, and give some advice while we're at it. And the rest is history. From there, I did that for several years, and here we are.
I love it. I didn't know when I first got into when I first got into fantasy football, I was 13. So I don't think podcasts or iPods or anything of that realm. I remember my dad and uncle who ran the league that I got into at that age, scoring it using the newspaper. And
that's how I did it too.
Yeah, that was fantasy football players of today do not know the struggle that was once in place for making sure a fantasy league came to life.
Yeah. It's very true. Yeah. And it's, it does remind me in similar ways, because I got into podcasting, 20 years ago. I got into fantasy football a little bit longer, but watching the evolution of both has been similar in some ways, because technology has really advanced both, right?
Yeah.
Like you said, newspapers for statistics, and now it just is automatically delivered to your computer whenever you need it. So
Yeah.
it's pretty amazing to see.
Yeah, you're getting on the minute updates. Apps like Yahoo and ESPN sending touchdown and in the red zone alerts. It can be if you're having a good Sunday, your phone will ding quite often.
Yes, indeed.
I don't remember what I have vague memories of what that feels like. It's been a rough couple of years.
Yeah.
I just have you seen memories.
Have you seen my championship belt?
You've told me about this belt. My league has one too.
Here it is.
Oh yeah, there you go. My league has one too. I haven't had the opportunity to see it, only when it gets exchanged at the draft. I haven't won my league since 2009. It's been a bit of a dry spell. I don't want to talk about it. I should have won this year. That's
a whole other show.
Lost in the semis by 1 point. I would rather get my ass kicked than lose by 1 point.
Agreed.
In the playoffs.
Agreed.
Sucks.
Yep.
Well, Jay, let's move to your show. So you are in the music industry doing the Jay Franze show, connecting with acts and musicians, artists. It is your backstage pass to the music industry, as you call it. So what brought you into that world, and what's it like building a successful music show?
Well, I worked in the music business for 35 years, worked behind the scenes, recording artists. I'm primarily a recording engineer. So I would record and mix records for artists primarily in Nashville. So we did a lot of the country records. And towards the end of that career, I was teaching at the college, teaching engineering and producing to students. And I would bring in the people that I used to work with. I would bring them into the school to talk to the students. So that way they could talk to industry professionals and maybe meet the people they might intern with in the future. And so what we would do is just set them up on a stage in front. I would interview them in front of the class, and then the class could ask questions. And then as podcasting became a thing, we were issuing laptops and iPods and stuff to the students. And I remember walking through our lab and somebody was holding their iPod up saying, I don't understand what this podcast thing is. So we talked about it. We figured out what it was, and we started putting our interviews up on as a podcast. We had no idea what we were doing, but we did it. And it was just so they could learn. So later, I wanted to do a podcast of my own, and I wanted it just to be me and my friends. So I was considering the people I used to work with, my friends that would come on the show. We'd catch up, find out what they were doing in their career, and then eventually other people from outside of my friend group, PR firms and stuff, started reaching out. And now they send their artists and other people in the industry over to me, and we talk and have a good time. And it's just about having fun. But having fun doesn't mean you can't monetize it. It just means that you're not providing a product or a service.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that was with my podcast, the first one I ever did. It had the angle of fun and also the angle of eventually I'd like to monetize this. But for me, I was in the beer space. I had started a beer blog. I had just launched a craft beer app here in Pittsburgh where people could access the app and get connected to events and happenings with different partners that I had made. And it was starting to take off. And it was because some guy went on Twitter and started tearing me down about how terrible it was that I got the idea for doing a beer podcast, because he was doing one too. And in my head, I felt like I could just turn on a microphone and do it way better than this guy who had been doing it for multiple years. And I was humbled very quickly. But at the same time, I was pulled into the medium, and almost instantly my co-host and I, my best friend Jason, we started thinking about what could this show become? What could it be? Like, again, we didn't really plan the launch. We just said, we're going to do this. But once we got into it, we started thinking about where could this go? And it was so funny that this, as we sit and record today, it was yesterday, was the 10-year anniversary of our first episode going viral, because we had a woman in Australia who wrote this horrible article slamming the craft beer industry. I grabbed hold of that and we tore her apart for an entire episode and read her article and why she was wrong. And I didn't know she had a Twitter account, so I couldn't tag her, but some of her friends in Australia heard the episode and shared it with her. And before we knew it, we're just watching our numbers skyrocket because these people were hate listening to our show. And we still laugh about it today because that was just hilarious, because they were just tearing us apart on Twitter. So we were going back and forth and we're just like, man, Australia hates us. But overall, it sort of put the show on the map. But at the same time, we knew we had a lot of work to do. And down the road, we were thinking, yeah, there might be a way to advertise this or get sponsors. But for right now, we're having fun, right? That was the question we kept asking ourselves. This is something that we're passionate about, and we get to talk about it whenever we want, as free will as we want. That's really what kept us invested. And for me, I already knew I had something that was adjacent to that podcast that I could monetize. So building the content was just fun. And I think for me to contribute advice to anybody that's looking to go down this road, if you do have monetization in mind, start with something that you can have fun with, because it's going to allow you to get better and eventually create a product that can be monetized.
And you won't want to quit.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's what I've been sitting here as you guys have been sharing. That's what I've been thinking about this whole time is if you're not doing it for the money, then what's going to keep you going? What's that factor that's going to keep you consistent? You know, are you setting, what are those benchmarks that you set for yourself if it's not monetarily? So I'm curious what you guys think about that.
I would say that it's picking a topic or picking a subject that you could talk about if no one's listening. Because that's the reality of starting a podcast. When you're brand new, your audience is going to be smaller. And sometimes people think that's a bad thing, because why would I put all of this work and all of this effort forth if no one's going to hear it? But what you don't realize is that you're probably not that good at the craft yet. There's no shame in that whatsoever. We all have to start somewhere, and we all have to find our voice and build confidence and eventually get to a point where we feel incredibly comfortable with the people we're talking with and the overall content that's being produced. It's better to do that with a smaller audience than in front of a huge one, right? Because less people are going to hear you F it up. So embrace the smaller audience at first, but grab hold of something that you could really sink your teeth into. If it's strictly for your hobby and it's never going to be something you're going to build a brand around, that's okay. Find something that you're constantly talking about with your friends. Like you said, Mark, it was fantasy football for you. Jay, you were in the music industry, so it was very natural that you would go down that path and build a podcast around that. At the time when I was working in the beer space, it started as a hobby. It morphed into, I had plans on how I could monetize things. It was a natural extension to continue talking about this liquid that I was incredibly passionate about and build content around that. It made me not want to quit. I think I look back on 10 years in podcasting now, that was the original lure for me. I often wonder, had I built that podcast around something else, even though the show didn't last, I think we made it to in the 70s with our episode count, even though that show didn't last long term, what if I had started a podcast about something that I just wasn't as passionate about? If my buy-in overall for that topic would have died, would my love for podcasting have died as well? I don't know. That's more speculation than anything, but I feel like my love of this medium has continued to grow because I started with something that I was also passionate about, and it just blew up from there. No pun intended.
I love it.
Maybe there's a pun intended.
Maybe.
But nevertheless, I think that there is a lot that people can gain from just the ability to talk about what they love. And again, that's something we see every day. Social media plays a big part of this. And of course, podcast content. That's a natural 1-2 punch for anybody with social media and a podcast to be using that platform to share what they have. And it's just another way to amplify their voice. So that's another thing I think we can explore with this conversation is the benefit of building a social media presence around your podcast. I think the more that you're committed to building good content, the better your social media presence is going to become. And that can fuel how much passion you have for continuing to build the content as well, because you naturally bring more people into not just listen to your content, but also talk about it in that open forum. So when you guys, Jay, again, you're doing this today, and Mark, you've done this with your show in the past. How does the social media element of podcasting play into your overall passion for continuing to build your episode content and continuing to push your show forward? We'll start with you, Jay, and then Mark, you can talk about how you've used that in the past.
Yep.
All right. Well, I have an account on probably every platform that's out there. Not that I utilize all those platforms, but I have the account. So if something does happen, I want to be involved in the conversation. So I go to the platforms that have the conversation going on. So even though I might have, like I have an account on X, or what I call Twix, but I have an account on Twix there, and when there's a conversation going on, I'll participate. I'm not always posting on that, but I want to be part of the conversation, because the posts, in my opinion, don't really matter all that much. That's just awareness. Here I am, look at me. But the conversations to me are what matters. So when I see people that I know talking about a subject, or talking about maybe a new release or this new artist, I get involved in that. And that to me is where the value is. And it's not just on Twitter, it's also on Instagram. It's, every other platform, even TikTok, even though that's a little harder to have a conversation. But I find myself having conversations, and through those conversations, I'm finding artists that I wouldn't normally work with or wouldn't normally have access to. So it could be a new artist, it could be an artist that's at the end of their career, but then I can open up that conversation and eventually offer them the platform for them to come on the show. So the networking there comes from the engagement and the conversations, not necessarily the posts. But to answer your question, or to take it one step further, is the platform of choice for me is typically Instagram.
Okay, that makes sense. So Jay, I think for me, or Jason, I think actually it was Facebook, and it was particularly Facebook groups. And that when I first say Facebook, I feel like, oh, I'm going to sound so outdated, but Facebook groups is still a thing.
Yeah.
And I find that even to this day, that's where I like to go to find new communities and to build my own. Talk about, to Jay's point, wanting to be a part of the conversation. I find that I can really find a lot of good conversations there, and it does help. In turn, it does help bring awareness to what I'm doing over on my show. And I don't need to sit and scream it from the rooftops either. I just have to be a part of the conversation. And then people start to get curious. Oh, this guy knows a thing or two. Oh, let me go check out his profile. And then that's where things start to snowball. I find that still works to this day. And it doesn't matter whether you're doing a hobby podcast or a professional podcast. Either way, we all, I think, if we're in this game, most of us want to build a community in some way, shape, or form, or be a part of one. And I think that social media allows that. That's one of the best places to do that, at least as far as convenience goes. It's one of the best places to do that.
And Jason, can I tag on that for one more second?
Sure can.
I think you're making a good point between the hobby and the professional, but I do think there's one level in between there as well. So if you get the people who are doing the entertainment style, like I mentioned earlier, you might not have a product or a service, but you still have something that you're drawing people into and something that can be monetized. So there's, as you are both aware, there's plenty of ways to monetize a show. But my thought process is, when you're dealing with an entertainment show, that it's a different approach. So we often listen to the experts who tell us there is one way of doing something, or there's a set standard of a way you should be doing something. And to me, that's not necessarily always the case, or at least not coming from my point of view. So I like to keep the view open a little wider when we're talking about how to monetize something.
No, I agree completely. I know, Mark, you said the magic word, community. That's really where it's at. And I think about podcasting a lot. I know I've said this to you guys in multiple settings. When we're sitting here, it's the three of us, we're rapping, we're having fun, we get to build great content, but it's just the three of us. And there's nothing wrong with that in the moment. But when this content goes live, the hope is that the community can grab hold of it, they can enjoy it, but then they want to talk about it too, because that just expands on the conversation. It's like if somebody's at a party and you're three people standing around talking, and then a fourth person enters in, and now they have their thoughts on that subject matter. And it just adds to the conversation and makes it more engaging. It keeps things moving forward. That, to me, is one of the best parts of podcasting, if not the best, because that becomes the overall process of creating great content that could be monetized. And you never know who's going to listen and say, wow, there's something here. And they may offer something that you never thought of. Maybe it's a sponsorship. Maybe it's something that, again, I want to advertise what I have in here. What do you charge? You may not even have to do any legwork, because your efforts were placed on creating good content first. And that's really why I feel grabbing onto something you're passionate about is going to allow that to take place. The more effort you put in talking about something you love, you only get better at telling the stories revolving around that. And then when it comes time to say, all right, maybe there is something I can do to monetize it, you have better material that you could showcase. That's how you build. And it's not something you can just do after a couple episodes. I know I was in it back when, I know, Mark, please don't take this the wrong way, because I know you do your podcast on Clubhouse.
Yes,
and,
that's
and
fine.
It's still, and
I
you
won't.
still,
Don't worry.
No,
I got a very thick skin when it comes to Clubhouse at this point.
you have to, right?
Yes.
But I think that now what Clubhouse is versus what it was when I'm about to tell a story, it's way different. But when it was becoming this next big thing that everybody had to be a part of, right? I was in a forum on a panel, and somebody said, well, I just released my second episode and I really want to start doing advertising and monetizing this thing. I think I'm ready to do this. And everybody else on the panel started giving him all this advice. It was all terrible because it would never work for someone that new in the game. And then they said, Jason, do you have anything you'd like to add? And I went the complete opposite direction because I felt like he just wasn't prepared for what advertising was going to do. 2 episodes in, probably not a lot of content to build around. You're going to start peppering your audience with ads. It's an audience you haven't established yet. It lessens the listener experience. You're going to get pennies on the dollar. Start thinking about your content plan first and how can you build around that. Maybe find a couple affiliates if you want to monetize, but start thinking beyond just putting an ad or 2 or 3 or 4, which is really what the advice was. Ridiculous. And think about your content first, how you can continue to add value to that content and tell the stories that people want to hear. That'll start bringing the people in, and it justifies any type of advertisements you start running in the future.
Yeah. And, this is kind of tying, I think, what Jay was starting to talk about and what you're talking about. I told you this right before we started. There are a lot of people that come to me that have the non-product, non-service-based podcast. They're doing an entertainment style, and they'll tell me, all the podcast professionals, all they're doing is serving people who offer a service or a product and want to have a podcast. What about me? And that is one of the best things you can do is build a community, because then they want to start getting more from you. I used to work on a podcast that it was basically a comedy podcast. It was a former morning show on the radio that went podcast. And one of the things that I had to fight tooth and nail for was for them to start doing extra content, a 1 bonus show, because they did 5 regular shows a week, 1 extra bonus show a week. And at the time, not many people were doing that. Podcasting was still, this was like 10, 12 years ago. Not a lot of people were doing that. And I finally got them to at least try it. And to this day, they're still doing it. It's one of their biggest monetization, one of the biggest forms of monetization that they have, right? So sometimes you're not necessarily having to go out of your way to create some service or product. It's just give more. And if you've built that loyal community, they will pay for it, and they'll be happily pay for it.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jay.
There's another piece to that too, is that it's not always your standard, here's an ad, here's some money. So you can have partnerships and sponsorships versus advertising. Mm-hmm. So for me, working in the music business, and I do primarily an entertainment-based music show. So we have people come on and we talk about the news, we talk about what's going on in the industry and that type of stuff. And we're talking about people who are on the road. So a lot of times what we do is work with venues, and we partner with venues not to take their money, but to possibly provide us with tickets to shows. And that way we can promote the show that's coming up. We can give away a ticket and somebody can get into the show. So the audience is benefiting because they're getting tickets. The venue is benefiting because they're getting awareness, and the artist is benefiting because their show is being advertised, but it's not in a strict advertising way. So I think that type of partnership could work as well. It doesn't always have to be about the dollar.
You're absolutely right. I an example I can give from my show, we got to do an interview with Claudio Sanchez, the lead singer of Coheed and Cambria, because I had just gone out on a limb one day on Twitter, because one of the breweries I worked with, the 2 brewers, were huge fans. So I knew they were coming to town and we were probably going to go to the concert, but I had sent them a message on Twitter saying, is it possible, if you guys have the time, to come down and I'll give you a tour of the brewery, but I wanted to surprise the brewers. And their response was, actually, would you like to do a collaboration beer? I was like, wow, talk about, I raise and they go all in. I'm like, hell yeah, we would. I don't know how that's going to work, but I'm sure they'd want to do it too. And one thing led to another, and we were able to get that together. They never came to the brewery, but they would put their name on it. We were able to make labels that had their logo. Like, it was cool as hell. And I just said, all right, well, this limb worked. Let me try another one. I said, hey, I have a podcast. Would we be able to sit down with the band and do an episode? And they're like, yeah, we'll hook that up. So now all of a sudden we're sitting in the room, and I got to have my friends that were brewers come in and be a part of it. And it was just an amazing experience. There was no money exchanged, but those are memories that can't be replaced.
And connections.
Memories, connections. And then we went to an after party after the podcast, and they handed me the mic, said, hey, can you introduce the band and let everybody know they're here? I'm like, Jesus, this doesn't end. This is amazing. You know what I mean? Like, that was a day that I'll never forget. Yeah. All because I just said, hey, let's see what happens if I try this. If they say no, they say no, and we move on. But those types of things can't be replaced. There wasn't a dollar exchange, but everybody won that day. It was fun.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's a big part of it. I mean, a lot of this, I get to go to a lot of shows. I get to go backstage to a lot of shows because when the artists come through town, they say, hey, yeah, let's meet up when we come to town. And then when they come to town, we send them a message and we get to go to the show, and it's fun. You get experiences that you wouldn't normally get. And people, like you said, we go to bars and we introduce bands. So it's a good time. So it doesn't always have to be about the dollar. It can be paid and fun for sure.
Yeah. And as we've said a couple times here in this conversation, it could eventually lead to monetization, but enjoy the journey because you get to have experiences like that if you do it right. So speaking of doing it right, we've got a couple minutes here before we wind down. So let's all share one tip that you would give to a person that wants to start a podcast more on the hobby side, more for the entertainment side of things. More than likely, they're not bringing a huge budget to the table. So what would you recommend they do to get started on the right foot? Because we don't want somebody thinking that they have to spend thousands of dollars on equipment and studio space. Each of us will give a tip on what we feel is the best way to get started. I'll leave the floor open to you boys to kick us off.
Wow. Best way to get started. Is that the question?
Best way, one tip to get started. And again, if it's an equipment issue or an equipment thing, what would you do to have the right mentality? Obviously, we talked about this throughout the season. Mindset's huge, so you want to have that. But if I'm just doing this knowing that money's not coming right away, what should I think about first?
Yeah.
All right. Well, my wife would probably call me a perfectionist, and I don't really believe that I am, but she calls me one. And I think the reason she calls me one is because I think things through. So I think it would be important before somebody presses record or before they release an episode that they think the whole process through from start to finish. Because a lot of times you realize something after you do it, you realize, oh, I could have done that differently, or I could have done that better, or anything. So if you think that process through, hopefully you work through a lot of those challenges before you release your first product, your first episode. So think it through. It doesn't have to be the world's best microphone. It doesn't have to be the world's best recorder. It doesn't have to be, the best environment. Just think everything through, kind of run a mental check of the process of what your recording process will be like, and see if you can catch any of those low-hanging fruit items that you can fix before you start.
Excellent. Mark?
Yeah, so I'm going to double down on the whole community thing. And the reason why, it's really to start building a community even before you get started. And again, it goes back to what Jay was saying, get involved in other communities first. That's where I think if you aren't spending money on trying to build an audience quickly, you got to do it grassroots and go in there and be a part of communities, contribute, add value to it. And the other thing about it is that by having community, if you don't have money as the driving factor right now, in my experience, having community has always held me accountable to stay consistent. It gives me that, it continues that desire for me. It gives me that motivation. And, that's something that I need to keep going. If it's not going to pay the bills, fine. But I'm going to then need connections. I'm going to need community who are going to be waiting for that next episode and wanting that next episode. And if I don't put that out, I'm going to hear about it. I need that to keep me going, because look, if if you aren't making money, and a lot of people, even if their intention is to make money, you don't always make the money at first when you get started. So you got to find reasons that's going to fuel you to keep going, because it is a hard thing to keep up with a podcast on a regular basis. So I find that building that community, having that responsibility to deliver really goes a long way for me.
That's excellent. And I think what you're saying in a lot of ways is that you're building an audience before you even launch your show.
Yeah.
And that can be huge, and you never know what that could become. So I can't really top either of yours advice. So I will just say, to wrap this up, don't start with a Blue Yeti. Get a good mic.
Good. That's a good one.
I'll keep it simple. But overall, don't get wrapped up in spending thousands of dollars right out of the gates. Fall in love with the craft first. And you can do that with a relatively inexpensive microphone that still produces high quality sound. If you have any questions about that, Mark, Jay, or myself are great resources to contact, and I'll put everybody's contact information in the show notes. But having the mindset of craft first, equipment second, monetization third, that's probably the best path, because you're going to understand the value that comes from podcasting isn't just wrapped up in money. It can be for the love of the medium. See how I worked in the title of the episode? So that's where it's at. And that from there can blossom into a lot of beautiful things, but you have to give it an opportunity. Too many people start without that long-term vision of how they're going to keep this going. And sometimes I question the loyalty to that passion if that's what happens. So grab hold of an idea you love and start running with it. Start recording, build that community, and see what happens. I guarantee some good things will come from it if you stick to it. So that will wrap up this amazing conversation with Marc Ronick, Jay Franze, and myself, Jason Sircone, here on Let's Blow This Up, the Season 3 co-host collective. Boys, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, buddy.
Glad to have your insights. And as I said, I'll put contact information for Mark and Jay in the show notes. Make sure you're checking out Mark's podcasting morning chat. If you're watching the video, he's seen the billboard the whole episode. And be sure to check out Jay Franze's The Jay Franze Show each and every week. I'll have links to those in the show notes as well. Until our paths cross again here on Let's Blow This Up, I am Jason Sircone, reminding you to stay explosive.